My name is Roko Belic, and I am here to tell you a story about my father. Because in 2001, my father got into a rowboat on the east coast of the United States, a boat with no motor and no sail, and he started to row towards Europe. It was a trip that took him 4.5 months, and it was the fulfillment of a dream of his lifetime. The dream began in Yugoslavia, where he grew up on the sea, what is now Croatia. He spent a lot of time on the ocean. He loved boats, and here he is with his father. He's the little guy on the right, falling in love with the ocean and boats and wanting to live a life at sea. When he was a few years older, he used to stand in the port and take notes of all the cargo ships that came in and out of port, and he would imagine the amazing places they had come from and the exotic places they were going to. And he decided that he wanted to live his life on the sea as a merchant marine. A merchant marine is somebody who travels around the world on a cargo ship and sees exotic lands and meets interesting people. It's a life of adventure. And when he was about 13 years old, he told his father, my grandfather, that that's what he wanted to do. And my grandfather said, "Are you interested in anything else, just by chance?" And my dad said, "Yeah, I think it would be pretty cool to be a doctor as well. I'm interested in medicine, but I really want to live this life of adventure." My grandfather very kind of openly said, "Well, look, it's your life. You're 13 years old, it's your life. You can make the decisions you want to make. But consider this before you make that decision. If you become a doctor, and in a couple years you decide to change your mind, that you don't like it, and you want to become a merchant marine, you'll be able to do it. Every cargo ship needs a medic on board, and it'll be easy for you. If, on the other hand, you become a merchant marine, and you then, in a couple years, decide that that's not what you want to do, you want to become a doctor, you'll be totally unqualified, and it won't happen." So my dad took this very pragmatic advice, and he went to medical school, and he got his residency in the United States. He and my mother came over here, and he began his life as a cardiologist. Eventually, my brother and I were born, and my dad ended up as the head of a cardiology department of one of Chicago's major hospitals. He absolutely loved the work, and he worked so hard, we barely ever saw him when we were growing up. That's what he was doing day in and day out. But his dream to be on the sea didn't die. That's him as a teenager in Yugoslavia. And around his 50th birthday, he came up with this sort of crazy idea to row a boat across the ocean. He thought, maybe when I retire, when I've done this career, I feel like I've done it well, maybe then I can indulge this childhood dream. And so he sketched out the design of a rowboat that would be different than other ocean-going rowboats in that it would be enclosed. It would be like a capsule that would protect him from the elements, but enable him to endure this voyage that would take months. He found a professional boat designer to draw it up in blueprints and found a master boat builder to make the boat. And for a few years, that was his passion. He put the boat in Lake Michigan to test it out, to work out its kinks. And every summer, he would spend a few days, if not a few weeks in the boat, a couple times rowing all the way to the northern tip of Lake Michigan, some 400 miles away. You can see the oars stick out the side. It's a very unorthodox kind of boat. People thought it was a life raft, which I guess some way symbolically it was, or some kind of a submarine. And my dad loved it. Here he's wearing a shirt that says, "Never give up," one of his mottos when it came to rowing. He loved the experience so much, he was convinced that rowing the ocean was the right thing to do, and he dreamed of the day that he would finally be able to put the boat in the ocean. But by this point in life, our parents had been long divorced. My father had fallen in love, married again, and had 2 daughters. And his new family were absolutely uninterested in any idea of Dad getting into a rowboat and rowing across the ocean. It was crazy, it was irresponsible, it was dangerous, and why the hell would anybody want to do that anyway? So when my dad retired, he tried to busy himself with a workshop he built in the basement, essentially doing arts and crafts projects. But after making so many lamps and so many sculptures and so many collages, he realized that this is a dream that he had had his whole life, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. And in May 2001, my brother and I went to the East Coast with our dad, put his boat in the water as he prepared for this trip. He loaded this boat up with over 1,000 pounds of equipment, food, supplies, satellite phone, and he shaved his head for the adventure because he knew there'd be no barbers out at sea. My dad wanted to do this very, very low key. He didn't want any publicity or press. He didn't want to be in the newspaper. He wasn't raising money for a charity. He didn't want anybody to know he was doing it except his family and a few close friends. But sure enough, the day before he left, a local journalist caught up with him and asked him the obvious question: why would you possibly want to get into a boat with no motor and no sail and try and row to Europe? And his response was, that is a question to which there is no answer. The next day, my brother and I saw this image, which is our father rowing out of the harbor towards the horizon. At 62 years old, he was the oldest person ever to attempt such a journey. He had a satellite phone, and every couple weeks he would call me, and he would describe various amazing incidents. For example, one call, he described a 360-degree sunset, where the entire sky was some sort of technicolor dream of swirled colors. He'd never seen anything like it. On another call, he described a giant sea turtle that followed him on and off for days, that he felt was becoming like a companion. He called other times to describe encounters with huge schools of hammerhead sharks, which, although they were somewhat threatening, he felt safe in his boat. He was completely alive, and I had never heard him sound more happy in his entire life. But his trip was taking a little longer than he expected. And about 4 months into a trip that was supposed to be 3 months long, he started running out of food. And he ended up flagging down a huge cargo ship, the kind of ship that he had dreamed about working on as a kid. This picture was taken by a merchant marine on that ship just a few moments before he lowered down a few bags of gourmet food, which my dad was very grateful for. About 10 days later, the first storm of the storm season hit. Now, my dad had planned his trip to be between the end of one storm season and the beginning of the next, because apparently you do not want to be in a rowboat in the middle of the ocean when the big storms hit. In this particular storm, I should say, because of the delays he experienced at the beginning with some headwinds and some currents that weren't behaving the way he'd expected, his trip was taking longer than he thought. This storm, it was reported that the gale force winds were up to 70 miles an hour, and the waves were as high as 4-story buildings. At 10:30 p.m. on September 30th, the Royal Coast Guard in England received an emergency radio transmission from his boat. He sent it with something called an EPIRB, emergency radio beacon. It was about this big with an antenna. By flipping a switch and pushing a button, it would send an automated signal to the Coast Guard. He couldn't talk through it, but it would tell them the identity of the boat and the fact that there's one passenger on board. In the middle of the night, an amazingly heroic crew flew out 230 miles from the coast of England. My dad had rowed over some 3,000 miles, and he was only a few days from landfall when they got this signal. These guys flew out to almost the limitations of the fuel supply that a helicopter could endure. And when they got there, they saw this little beacon bobbing up and down in the water, but it was so stormy and windy and rainy and dark, they could see this blinking light on the beacon, but they couldn't see the boat. So some incredible guy went down on a rope. Imagine in a helicopter, 70-mile-an-hour winds, 40-foot waves, and you're dangling from a rope to find some guy that might be down there. What he found is this radio beacon, but unfortunately, the cable that connected it to my father's boat had snapped. That's apparently not uncommon in storms of this ferocity. And for the next month, there was a very heroic rescue and search operation underway. By boats, by planes, people literally walking along the coastline in Ireland, scanning the horizon for any sign of my father or his boat. It was then that I learned that communities, coastal communities like this around the world, endure hardships. It's not uncommon in a single storm season for 5 or 10 or even more people to be lost at sea. These are not only the people in the boats that capsize, it's sometimes the rescuers themselves who die. I started to wonder, why on earth would people who have to work as fishermen or oil rig workers, people who have to risk their lives in order to put food on the table, to provide for their families, why on earth would they take a minute out of their lives, let alone risk their own lives, to look for my dad, who was basically on a joyride? I mean, he was rowing the ocean for the hell of it. He couldn't even explain why. And when I started to inquire, the response came back loud and clear. They said, look, we know what it's like to be out at sea, and we respect and honor the courage that it would take for a person to decide to get into a boat with no propulsion other than a couple of oars and the strength of his own body and attempt a journey like this. We want to see him return safely to his family and friends. Unfortunately, a month later, a fisherman found his boat capsized. The contents of the entire boat were swept away by the ocean. That's also apparently normal in storms like this. And my dad's body was never recovered. This is an image of it being pulled ashore. In a world where people are often seeking and prioritizing safety and comfort and security, his story doesn't make sense. Why would somebody do that willingly? He had a comfortable life. But I think the people who searched for him understood. Because when we hear about somebody who willingly faces a challenge that's so great that it puts their life at risk, something deep inside us is ignited. Somewhere down there we know that that's the spirit that moved early human beings around the globe in search of new lands. That's the spirit that explores the deepest jungles and outer space and mankind's potential. When we dream, we push ourselves to find our limits, and sometimes in the process of that, we acquire the ability to overcome those limits. I believe my dad's journey gets at what it means to be fundamentally human. Because as a species, we're not defined by idleness, but by action. Not by fear, but by courage. Not by resignation, but by hope. My dad's journey inspires me to dream. Now I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I have no idea if she's going to want to become a merchant marine or a doctor or probably something totally different. And I'm sure I'm going to give her all kinds of pragmatic advice the way my grandfather gave to my father. And though I never will want her to die for her dreams, I will be sure to encourage her to live for them. Thank you very much.